So the other week when I was in Philadelphia, I was talking to a Philly poet named Catherine Christiani, and she'd heard about SLEERICKETS, so she said, "So I hear you do a podcast." I said, "Yeah." She said, "It's about poetry, right?" I said, "Yeah, it's mostly about poetry." Because I feel like, we do occasionally episodes and other things. I just said, so, in fairness, we do get into some other things, but yeah, it's definitely mostly about poetry. And then from the corner of the bar, Coleman, who was standing there with his wife, just very quietly listening, he just said, I thought, like, fuck, if that's, like, oh, okay. So if, I guess it's only maybe less than half. I don't know. I still try to retain like a 51% family interest in poetry in this podcast, but God only knows. This is, in case you have not worked it out, SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. I am your host, Matthew Buckley Smith, and this week I do have some poetry for you. So Jonathan Farmer, critic, poet, writer, teacher, writer. Well, I guess if you're a poet and a critic, you're a writer, but former guest as well, returning guest, I should say. He's come on to discuss Lucille Clifton, a poet who is much celebrated and about whom I've had sort of mixed feeling. Like, I have not been totally sold on her poetry in the past, but he's written a fair amount about her and read a lot more of her work than I have. So he put together a packet of poems, and he also found an interesting article on her by Jordan Davis. All of that will be linked in the show notes. And he gave, he sort of made not necessarily a case for her, but he sort of presented her for my consideration. And I definitely learned some things. So this is our conversation. There is a whole nother portion of it that I will probably release on the Secret Show as a, really, like, we get into, like, probably there's a little more intense disagreement in the second part, and we certainly talk a lot more about the politics involved or theoretically involved. But for now, here is my conversation with Jonathan, and then at the very end, I'm going to try to keep this up because I think it's sort of fun. I'm going to include a little preview of the most recent Secret Show episodes, so you can check that out. And then if you would like to hear more, you can go to sleerickets.substack.com and hear the rest and or 80 odd more episodes. All right, so here's my conversation with Jonathan Farmer about Lucille Clifton. You sent me this selection of Lucille Clifton poems, and then this very, like, provocative and sort of maddening but interesting essay by Jordan Davis about her, and about, it sounds like there was a noteworthy anthology that came out around the same time that he talks a good deal about, which is edited by somebody Charles Henry Rowell's anthology of contemporary African-American poetry called Angles of Ascent. And it sounds like it did stir a little bit of debate. You said an unfair but not inaccurate review that got from Mary Baraka, which is a nice characterization. Unfair but not inaccurate.
Yeah.
And he has plenty of to say about it as well, but that seems to be sort of the occasion, and then mostly his focus is on Lucille Clifton's poetry. Yeah, I had a few different thoughts about this, and Jordan Davis it looks like at the time this came out in The Nation in 2013, and he was at the time the poetry editor of The Nation, it looks like.
Yeah, as far as I know, he's kind of retreated into his own interests more. Like, I don't know that he writes criticism or edits or anything anymore. I know he still writes poems, or was still writing poems the last I knew, but and his poems are kind of quirky and strange.
That doesn't shock me reading this, but like his poems would be sort of quirky and strange. But it's like, it was a funny combination of, I don't know. I mean, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on it. It seemed like he had a good nose for certain things. Like, he pulled a lot of excerpts, and I would say most of the excerpts he pulled felt like, oh, this is like, I'm glad I'm reading this. This is like a cool excerpt. I was much more skeptical about his articulated thoughts on the excerpts, but like it feels like he has a nose for like, oh, this is interesting. Like this is worth reading. Which maybe that's what you need as a poetry editor.
Yeah, and he's an entertaining enough writer as well,
Yeah,
which
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
um
he's got some like good lines, good, he lands some paragraphs and sentences in memorable ways. I often find myself disagreeing with his claim, but like
yeah.
it's funny, like even the opening statement, what's essential to know about the poetry of Lucille Clifton, what likely scared her about writing, and what I don't think anyone says about it is that when she is good, she kills. And then it's literally a poem about her killing roaches. And it's funny, like reading that, I was surprised by the publication date because it felt to me like almost a Twitter line.
Mm.
Like it's like because like it seems in part the part what he's getting at is that she's better with specificity and often with like the venting of strong emotion and specifically like anger or malediction than she is with. I think he is very right to say like she gets celebrated for her dreamy wise woman of the earth mode, which is actually like not her most poetically impressive mode.
Yeah, so I'll step back for one moment just to say kind of why I thought this was
Yeah,
worth
yeah.
talking about. There's a thing that seems to happen in most of the criticism of Clifton. I haven't gone back recently to see what's out there that's new, but there's a defensive quality to it.
Mm.
A lot of the articles about her will start by listing her prizes and honors, which are fine, but like I don't think are really commensurate with her importance. But it's like there's this need to prop her up and to prove that she's worthy of attention, that she's legitimate. What follows is often something that doesn't have much critical bite. That's just so kind of careful with the poems that it just doesn't get around to saying much about them. And so I'm just grateful for this in part because he takes her as being worthy of criticism, of
Yeah.
thinking seriously about.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Talking specifically about like the sound of some of the lines and some of the
Yeah,
the like wordplay, like specific technical things she's doing.
yeah, and making a case for what's good and what's bad. I
Yeah,
don't. I have I have multiple objections to both sides of that equation, but I'm glad to see somebody trying to do it, which
yeah,
doesn't seem to be the norm
yeah,
out in the
definitely.
country.
Yeah, I was no, I was grateful for that, and I did think like he chooses these sort of three. It's also like I think as is often true of good reviews or good critical writing, it is maybe the best thing it does is just provide a bunch of juicy, memorable excerpts to like show
Mhm.
you some of the stuff that is worth finding that is good there. And just sort of, so here I'll read a little bit of this sort of the stuff he quotes early on from Clifton. At last we killed the roaches, Mama and me. She sprayed, I swept the ceiling, and they fell, dying onto our shoulders, in our hair, covering us with red. The tribe was broken, the cooking pots were ours again, and we were glad. Such cleanliness was grace when I was 12. Only for a few nights, and then not much. My dreams were blood, and my hands were blades, and it was murder, murder all over the place. And it's like it's funny and human, and it even in the next excerpt, it's like even more extreme, where she says, "It was a holocaust of roaches, bodies, parts of bodies, red all over the ground. I didn't ask their names; they had no names worth knowing."
Yeah,
It's like it is, it accurately captures the sort of the like furious bloodlust of like finally getting rid of some horrible nuisance that's been tormenting you.
yeah,
And
and that second one, as Davis says, is ultimately a more interesting poem than the first one. It's a
yeah,
later poem. It's a more interesting poem. When you read through Clifton's Collected, you start to notice her kind of going back and trying out the same phrase from a different.
yeah,
There's a lot where she just keeps reworking different things and experimenting in different ways. And the concluding two lines of the one you were just reading. Now I watch myself whenever I enter a room. I never know what I might do. And you
yeah,
said
yeah, yeah. Which
it's
is like it's a funny line.
it's funny. It's
It's like,
funny, and
yeah,
that's part of what ends up frustrating me about Davis's praise of her is that he takes her as just this person who's like trying to get her emotions out. She's somebody who had these historically important and difficult experiences, and she's trying to express those feelings, and she's able to express them in a way that causes us to feel things as well. And like that's fine. It's not wrong,
Yeah.
but it leaves out a lot. And one of the things it leaves out is how much fun she is. Like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
she's a fun poet. More often than not, you can feel her playing. Like she wants to entertain, and she's a good entertainer. And she's not just that, but there's something so somber about his description of what he takes to be her best poems.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and this even the next one, which he excerpts, which I quite liked. It's taken from a poem called "Aunt Agnes Hatcher Tells," and this is just part of it. This is the excerpt. Your daddy, he decided to spread the wealth, as they say, and made another daughter. Just before the war, she came calling, looking like his natural blood. Your mama surprised us and opened her heart. None of his other tricks worked that good. Which is again
Mm-hmm.
just like, oh God, it's just a knife twisting line because it's
Yeah.
like it initially you do have this sort of cynical view of what he's doing, but then there's a moment of like real poignancy and emotional connection. This child comes in looking like his natural blood. Your mama surprised us and opened her heart, and then we get like the sort of the Machiavellian explanation, like, oh wow, he really pulled a fast one. Like none of his other tricks worked that good. His line about that, though, I think in a way is, I mean, he says I think some true things about it, but I think he is a little bit off the mark. He does say such language is usually not thought of as elevated, yet it compresses into 6 lines a stirring expression of blah blah. Like, well, sure, like both of those things are true, but what is the contradiction? Like, is elevated language the same thing as
Right.
compressed language? Isn't rap very compressed and also very demotic in its register?
So I think part of what he's pointing to, I'm trying to flip through pages at the same time I talk, and I'm not smart enough to do those two things at once. There's a moment in the afterword to the collected poems where Kevin Young kind of puts her inside the Black Arts movement. He has a great line that I'd love to find, so I don't mangle it. But he talks about it. He says Black Art sought many things, but above all, a public poetry, one aware of and even pitched toward a newfound audience that it was both meeting and making. And I do think it's true of Clifton that she is.
Sorry, say that again if you would.
Oh shit! Page away.
Sorry, I just
It's okay. Black arts sought many things, but above all, a public poetry, one aware of and even pitched toward a newfound audience that it was both meeting and making.
okay.
Um, and I don't know enough about the Black Arts movement to know if that's more broadly true. I assume it is if that's what Kevin Young says, because he's really smart and he does his homework. But certainly of Clifton, there's a real awareness of an audience. And one of the things she talks about in some of her interviews is that she wanted to help people, and she thought a lot, I think, about how to write poems that you could read without having an education, or
Mhm.
having a specifically literary education. There's a great line that Davis has,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah. About
as an
about
aside. Yeah,
literary poetry.
talks about literary poetry that ultimately becomes so impoverished of reference to lived existence that you have to go to school to find out what it's talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and so I think she thought a lot about how to use language in a way that made her poems available to people who hadn't studied poetry. And I, you don't typically need a dictionary to read Clifton's poems. And so I assume that's what Davis is pointing towards. But he's pointing towards it at a
Yeah.
weird moment in a weird way.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I mean, and it's she none of his other tricks worked that good, so she's using
mhm,
vernacular English. She's not good as an adjective,
right.
not an adverb, but it just seems like a strange way, a strange use of yet,
Yeah.
because like
Yeah.
demotic
Totally.
speech is compressed all the time. Like
Yeah.
that's part of what vernacular language is. Um,
and is elevated as well. It's not a contradiction either.
yeah, I mean, elevated. I guess like I think of as being maybe there are kind of two different ways to think about that. There's like an elevated register where there's
Mm-hmm.
high or formal speech versus low or informal speech, but then there's also speech that's poetically elevated in the sense that it is made to do more than prose
Mm-hmm.
do. And in that sense, sure, like
And
vernacular speech can be elevated. Certainly, that's
and
what like
you just you I don't think you read her poems and think and mistake the fact that you're reading a poem. I think they are, for all that they work to present a sort of recognizable human being. I think they're also very much poems. They're not shy. They're not hiding the fact that they're literary creations.
no. I mean, I there are times when I wonder about the craft of them. There are times where they feel a little bit careless, or like they're sort of they're not, or they're like either the line breaks or the phrasing feels a little bit unworked over, or not
Mhm.
necessarily unconsidered, but unreconsidered. But I mean, I think like the point that Davis almost makes and then sort of trips over himself on the way to making is that she is really good as a lyric poet. She's really
Mhm.
good at conveying emotion in an honest way. What I think she is less good at, and what she is often celebrated for, is conveying wisdom. And like that, like even in that great excerpt about the dad, having the additional daughter, and none of his other tricks work that good. The poem heads one way. Here is a story of the poet's father, her half sister, and how her mother coped with betrayal. Then pivots to give the father the shaming he deserves. He misses the part where the actual pivot occurs, which is in the response to the daughter's appearance. But also like this is not actually a very like if this is a poem about giving the father the shaming he deserves, I think it's not like that's a far less interesting poem than this actually is, which is about
Mhm.
the experience of going through that moment, of being a person in that moment. I mean, I think like, I mean, similarly, he really praises her poem "Wishes for Sons" for being not bitter and not glib and being very wise and compassionate. And I think, well, I don't know that that's true. I think like it's a very sharp and effective poem. It really gets a feeling out of you, but like I think it is a sort of a venting of spleen. Like I think it is a little bit of an expression of frustration at like having a certain experiences and having this other set of people who don't go through them, and sort of yeah, like with a little bit of delicious spite, wishing some of this on them to experience. Like it's a funny, zingy, compact, sharp poem. I don't think it's necessarily like the speech of a bodhisattva, you know?
Yeah. So you said a lot of things.
Yeah.
I agree that Wishes for Sons is not a venting of spleen, or I disagree that it's a venting of spleen.
Okay.
I agree that it's not a wisdom statement. I think it's so. I I think Davis sometimes is too comfortable conflating Clifton the author and Clifton the speaker. I think Clifton is usually, and there are obvious exceptions to this, like the Lucifer poem that I sent you. Clifton is usually presenting a version of herself, but she's also playing around with that version. She's always playing with the experience. Not always, always is wrong.
Yeah.
She's often playing with that experience, and she's having a lot of fun with it. Like there's something
Yeah.
winking, and not in a smug way, not in a needy way. He says something somewhere in here. She does not elicit pity. There's no untoward claim on the reader, no blame, no guilt. And I think that's pretty close to saying something really true about her, which is that she's just not a needy poet. She's a lot of poets who feel fun to me, or who feel like they're supposed to be fun to me, are just excruciating. Like I don't know if you've ever been trapped in a room with a mediocre stand-up comic, uh, but oh my God, like several of the worst social experiences I've had have been like being at parties with aspiring stand-up comics, and just the desperate need, like you're just, it's like I'm
Mhm.
on stage as the audience.
Yeah. I've been in
And
some
I
writing rooms where like no sentence can go through the air without somebody throwing a pun on it. You're like, all
Yeah.
right, okay,
And
just
then
settle down.
and then waiting for you to laugh, like staring at you, waiting for you to laugh. And like there's not there's something, she's much more confident than that. And I think that's one of the things that makes her appealing is that she is so confident in what she's doing.
Do you want to read Wishes for Sun since we were talking about
Yeah,
it?
yeah, got it here.
Because yeah, I think it's a very entertaining and very like I don't think
Yeah,
there's really any wasted breath in it. I think it's a very
yeah.
compact little sharp poem. I do think it's a sort of a malediction. Like it's an effective it's
Oh,
like a loving
yeah.
malediction, but it's
I think there's something a little more complicated lurking under the surface, or in addition to that.
yeah,
But
yeah,
anyway,
because
it
I
is
think I think
poetic.
it would be a lesser poem if it were even just the title, like making it Wishes for Sons
Yes,
rather than Wishes for
exactly.
Men
Yes,
makes
exactly,
it less
exactly.
like fuck
Yeah,
you.
exactly. Yeah, like there is the fuck you. There's the joy of the fuck you, and there's also the awareness of something else. So wishes for sons. I wish them cramps. I wish them a strange town and the last tampon. I wish them no 7-Eleven. I wish them 1 week early and wearing a white skirt. I wish them 1 week late. Later, I wish them hot flashes and clots like you wouldn't believe. Let the flashes come when they meet someone special. Let the clots come when they want to. Let them think they have accepted arrogance in the universe, then bring them to gynecologists not unlike themselves.
Right. And that's a rim shot. Like
Yeah,
I think like the
yeah,
correct response to that poem is that it's funny. Like it's a but
yes,
I think unfortunately the response Davis seems to think is appropriate is
yeah,
mm, yes, amen. Which I
yeah.
think like that sucks. Like I like who what poet wants to write a poem that elicits an amen? Like
Oh,
it's that's a good
plenty of them.
line, you know?
Plenty do.
Plenty do. What
Yes,
good poet wants to elicit an amen? I don't know.
but no, yeah. Like I think one of the things that feels really important about Clifton is that in all kinds of ways, she is thinking about uh, and engaging with an imagined audience. You can feel in so many ways someone trying to do something for an audience. Oftentimes it's trying to entertain, sometimes it's trying to console, sometimes it's trying to bind up a community. Um, and then there's something where another thing he says, David says later on. Perhaps the central tension in Clifton's work is between declaring her gift for emotional acuity and knowing that it was a matter of luck that the gift chose her. No, that's not. I don't know if there's a central tension, but that's sure as shit not it. I think
Yeah.
one
Is
of the
that even
tension.
like if let's assume for a minute that that were true, that seems like a pretty dumb central tension.
Yeah,
Is that a good
but
tension to have? Like, is that for that to be
yeah,
what's at the center of your work? Like that you're declaring your gift and that your gift was a matter of luck? Like what?
yeah. There's so few poems that are reckoning with that. Like it's bananas. But I think one of the things that Davis gets right, and he does get a decent number of things right. One of the things he gets right is that there is this shift in her poems. There's this moment, I think he puts it 1/3 of the way through the collective, when you see a turn, and she gets more private. She's more scarred in her presentation of herself. She feels more present for good and often for ill inside a specific individual human body that is failing her while the bodies around her have failed her. And there are unwelcome things that she has to say. And I think there's a there is a tension that starts to emerge between her care for an audience and her desire to tell the truth, at least as an experience in the poems, whatever is actually motivating her. Um,
Is there a poem where that sticks out to you? That tension?
it's oftentimes a motion back and forth, but so there's one poem I don't have in front of me.
I'll just briefly interject that there's like I know you and I both had some heartache on the schoolyard at the hands of other boys growing up. And there's like a very high percentage of boy games that are concerned with the question of whether or not one flinches. And I was never good at those games because like I flinch standing alone in a quiet room. But like there was at least one thing that Davis said that like brought out my inner fourth grade bully. Like he said it's this excerpt, like it's one of the excerpts I think is not a great excerpt from her poetry. The last two lines are, "You might as well answer the door, my child. The
Yeah,
truth is furiously knocking." And he says,
yeah,
the uncanny shock of the last two lines,
yeah.
which caused an adrenaline spike whenever I read them. And that made me think like, Jordan Davis is somebody I would love to play slaps against. Holy shit. Like, I got a game for you called Stronger Than a Dollar. It involves a crisp 20 and a lit cigarette, and you'd be great at it, Jordan. Like, fucking that gives you an adrenaline spike.
So Poem to My Uterus, which is one of the ones I sent you. So this is, as she gets older, cancer comes and reappears. Her husband dies at a relatively young age. She says, "You, uterus, have been patient as a sock while I've slippered into my dead and living children." And there's a lot of writing like that. I think she's really good, and she doesn't always do this, but she's really good at naming things. One of the things that I think can work really well in a poem is naming things in a way that's surprising and apt. And she starts having more and more of these metaphors that insist on like this body that's made up of parts, of organs and bits that can break down and can be destroyed, and that are bloody and slimy and gross. And she has this knack for finding metaphorical descriptions of them that
Yeah.
are uncomfortable and unpleasant, but they're still in these poems that are kind of trying to find their way towards something that can be shared, something that an audience might at least find consolation in, if not comfort.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
It's a thing that like I find very like difficult even to imagine, which is she writes like often about her own body
mhm,
in terms that are both uh like sometimes like hair raising, like very
mhm.
harsh, unromantic terms that involve a lot of suffering or ugliness or pain or badness, but that are also like loving. Like she doesn't write
Yeah.
with hatred of her own body, or it's not just self-deprecation. It's like loving. I mean, it's almost like an auto blazon, but
Mhm.
it's not idealized at all. And like
No,
I find all of that like to me, it's like
it's it,
it's impossible to imagine writing that way about my own body.
yeah, it's almost willfully uncomfortable, but you can still, I think, feel that reaching for something sustaining.
Yeah, and it's not like the female stand-up move of like, oh, my neck, my vagina.
No,
It's not shitting on her own body. It's like writing with great care and appreciation for her body.
yeah. So here's a quotation I pulled out from a poem that's not in the packet. This is from Grandma Weir Poets. She writes, "Say rather I withdrew to seek within myself some small reassurance that tragedy, while vast, is bearable." Like that's not the best thing she wrote,
I don't know.
but I do think it gets at one of the things that happens in her poems, which is that what feels like a desire to care for other people in poems
Even the
starts to,
lumpectomy Eve, which is about her
yeah,
own like having
yeah,
a partial mastectomy, but it is both about this appreciation for her own body and what it's done, and it's like the ghost of all of those children that she's fed. And
yeah,
the ending, the all night it is the one breast comforting the other. I think
yeah,
that's quite. I don't know. I mean, I find that quite poignant.
yeah. And so, yeah, I think that increasingly you hear in the poems that desire to care for others having to work its way through this body full of organs and blood and cancers that she's also having to care for.
Yeah,
And I think the bridge is still that playfulness. I think the bridge is still so often it feels like she's trying to entertain herself and she's trying to entertain the people who read the poems.
yeah. I found really difficult, but memorable the poem June 20th.
Hmm.
Makes me think that she and I have the same birthday.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, I'm June 27th, so I think that
Yeah.
makes So June 20th is very short. I will be born in 1 week to a frowned forehead of a woman and a man whose fingers will itch to enter me. She will crochet a dress for me of silver, and he will carry me in it. They will do for each other all that they can, but it will not be enough. None of us know that we will not smile again for years, that she will not live long. In 1 week, I will emerge face first into their temporary joy. And, it's a strong closing line. Of course, the part that just jabs me like a red hot needle reading it is a man whose fingers will itch to enter me. And she, and there is reference elsewhere to, her being molested by her father, but then it continues and there's no further reference to that. And it almost like the way she talks about the father elsewhere in the poem, it doesn't seem like, it seems like this takes him by surprise. Like he's actually trying to be a good person. He's trying to do a decent job of this. And this almost like, it's not that he's not responsible for what he later does, but it's almost like it is a thing that it's not like he was always already a bad man. Like this is the thing that will come to be part of his life later. But in this moment, there's at least the possibility that things might go differently.
And you can hear too the work of trying to say things that are both true and fair.
Even his fingers will itch to enter me is like,
yeah,
that there will be a time when he doesn't do it, but he feels the urge to do it.
Yeah. The poems she writes are almost always short, and if they're long, they're almost always a sequence of shorter poems. They tend to end with some kind of twist. I mean, technically, I guess not a volta, but some kind of twist. But there's also just this constant twisting as they go. Sometimes she lands on phrases that feel too comfortable. I don't think that happens in this poem.
No, but there's one in here where she ends on basically a cliche that felt like, well, all right.
But there tends to be a real commitment to keeping the poem turning, and he says something. Davis says something to that effect when he talks about cruelty, the way she kind of hits a peak and then turns it in some way, and finds some new peak of intensity. I think she's often really good at figuring out how to keep a poem moving. It's interesting to me that a poet who foregrounds voice as much as she does, even in her oldest poems, feels as fresh as she does, like 70 years after some of those poems were written. And I think there is something, even when she lets a cliche or just an underrealized line stay in the poem, there's a kind of vitality that she is able to keep just in pacing. She's really good at pacing, and in the way that she keeps kind of turning the poems, even the poems that are most committed to comforting an audience.
Yeah, her line breaks don't always make sense to me.
Yeah, I agree.
She is good at writing like convincingly complete little. I almost think of them as like verses rather than lines, because sometimes they go beyond one line. And the poem "To the Unborn and Waiting Children" was one where I thought like it doesn't actually, I think, work very well as a poem or as an argument, but it has in it, like it's almost like the William Logan test. Like, oh, there is the voice of somebody who knows how to write poems speaking here, even if like some of what she's saying feels like that doesn't really make sense. Like, I went into my mother as some souls go into a church, for the rest only. But there, even there, from the belly of a poor woman who could not save herself, I was pushed without my permission into a tangle of birthdays. Listen, eavesdroppers. Eavesdroppers is a great apostrophe for unborn children. There is no such thing as a bed without affliction. The bodies all may open wide, but you enter at your own risk. You enter at your own risk is the like dead on cliche that I noticed. And like the claims in this poem don't, to my ear, make a lot of sense. Like, you went into your mother for the rest only. Like, what could that possibly mean?
Well, I mean, I think you have to understand that, for her, there's an entire spirit world that's very real. She did, a lot of kind of communicating with, the dead and things like that. So I think she really means that, like,
Yeah, but even if you take that as a given, how is going into a human mother doing it for rest? Like rest from
hmm.
what? Was there a spirit monster chasing her? Like, I don't, I mean, to me, this is nonsense. Like, this is like, I mean, I like to take people's religion seriously, but like, to me, that's like a nonsense statement.
Mm.
But I mean, again, like, I was pushed without my permission into a tangle of birthdays. Like, that's great. That's like somebody who has an ear for poetic cadence, even if
Hmm.
this is not a great example of things coming together. She does have a sense of what makes for a good verse, a good, as you said, like she has a natural sense of pacing. And in some poems, it really lands. I mean, there are certain lines that leapt out at me throughout, like something is in this night. I mean, it's almost no statement at all, but it's really eerie. And then the one that it actually ends up being a line of pentameter, but from the long Lucifer poem sequence. I have foreseen the evening of the world. Like that is chilling. That's like that could
Yeah.
be straight out of the Bible. I mean, she does also like borrow lines in funny ways. Like she borrows a line from the Violent Femmes, and then she borrows another line from Hamlet at the end of that poem. But like I have foreseen the evening of the world. I mean, I think it's in part because she just has an ear for what like makes for good lines, even though they're not. I mean, often they are broken over multiple lines on the page.
And she plays a lot with literary tradition. She has a untitled poem that starts, "If I stand in my window," that's playing with William Carlos Williams's, I don't know how to pronounce it, Dansereuse, however you pronounce that. And it's great. But she plays with Yeats in various places. Like
Yeah, yeah,
she's
yeah.
very
Forbid me
uh,
not my meditation as like lead me not into temptation.
oh yeah,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, certainly. There's a lot. Yeah, you can hear a lot that's in her ear already. But again, like that's the at least that was like what Aaron Pachian said was like the way to make sure that you don't write bad lines is to memorize sufficient quantities of good verse. Like just memorize enough great poetry, and you'll have an ear for it.
One of the things that struck, so I sent you this packet, I don't know how long ago, and I was going back and reading it, and I was like, why did I pick that? And something that started to occur to me is that I feel like she's the rare poet who's better for me when I read a lot of her.
Hmm.
Like
Okay.
two Clifton poems for me are better than one Clifton poem. Three Clifton poems are better than two. There's something that accumulates over time, and I agree with you. Like you know, many years ago when this collected first came out, I reviewed it for Slate, and one of the things that really stood out to me then is like how often, like, well, it's not a great poem, but boy, those are a few great lines.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And but it didn't feel like a waste of time to read the not great poem with a few great lines. Like everything still felt alive. It felt part of some larger thing that was accumulating, and I've almost started to think of it as like this character that she was creating and revising, that is Lucille Clifton, and for me, it's a very welcoming character. It's a very vibrant character, and it's a character that deepens over time.
So do like part of what I think I have gained in reading different kinds of literature, and I think of it especially when I'm reading older literature where the whole rhythm and shape of the language is a little
Mhm.
bit different than it is today, or rhythm and texture. One of the things I feel like I have gained is a it's like we have a word hoard, like we have like Beowulf a store of words that we know,
Mhm.
but we also have a kind of like grammatical and syntactical like landscape. Like we have certain
Mhm.
shapes of sentences and certain sounds that exist as possibilities in our minds based on things that we've read and heard and said in the past. What is it that you feel like you most take from her as a poet? Like in what way have you been altered as a reader, thinker, writer for having read her? Because it sounds like it may not be as much by having found a number of exemplary individual poems than by a sort of a larger habit or style or voice or something.
Yeah, I never know the answer to that question.
Okay.
It's so like it's so opaque to me how what I read turns into what I write. There have been rare examples where I'm writing something like, oh yeah, I can see how that's here, but for the most part, it's opaque to me. I like I like the work of a critic of trying to explain like how does this thing work and uh, if you were to take pleasure in this, how would you take pleasure in this? And if you were to find meaning in this, how would you find meaning in this? And I know I'm accumulating in some way, like all kinds of habits and cheats and structures, but I'm not smart enough to foreground those.
I mean, there are like, I guess one way I think about this is with, it's a reason that I do like teaching, even just for purely selfish reasons, because it helps me organize my thought about things that I think are worth reading. Like there is a model of teaching literature that says like, what is the important stuff to know about this piece of writing, and what is the correct or like sufficiently thorough digestion of this, of its meaning or its attributes that I can convey a a group of students. And like that is in part of what you're doing there is you're responding to like the necessity to like inform people about a tradition. I think in much more mercenary terms, because I mostly am teaching in the context of writing about what, like when I bring a story or a poem to writers, I think mostly about like how can we benefit from having read this? Like what things can we steal? What things are worth stealing? What is there worth noticing that is interesting that we can learn from? And I don't know if in all cases, like I wonder if the thing that is most worth learning from her is not necessarily the total unity and shape of individual poems, but more a willingness to come at things from a certain angle, or a willingness to like, or a certain like an ear for a certain way to phrase things. Like I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what that
Well,
would be exactly,
I,
because it does seem at times as if she's like they don't always feel like they're brought to a high shine.
yeah, I think the shape. It's very rare to me that the shape doesn't feel really polished and really composed. Uh,
Really?
as a like composition of sentences and sounds, the poems very rarely feel like they go flat sonically or in terms of pacing or anything like that. They What often feels true to me is one, the line breaks sometimes don't make sense to me, but two, it just feels like, oh, I wish you'd gone back and spent a lot more time on that line to find something a little more surprising to say or a more surprising way of saying it.
Yeah.
Um, but I think in terms of like just creating a structure of sentences and motions, I don't see many poems of hers that don't do that really well.
I guess I mean, my instinct is that it is seldom worthwhile to like pick up a poem by a poet and say, here is why this is not good, unless that
Hmm.
poem has been like especially held up for
Right.
celebration, because like every poet writes lots of bad poems.
Yeah.
I mean, I did, at least based on what I have read of hers, it did seem I was more or less convinced by Davis's claim that basically she's a really, really good poet, but she also writes way more other poems that are not so great. And to me, like
Hmm.
that is my experience with. I mean, I read a lot of the poems I read here, even in the selection, feel to me like I found myself writing on a lot of in response to like a lot of Davis's claims, like yet the tongue is a means of language. I wrote like uh-huh, and like I felt myself having kind of similar responses to some of Clifton's poetic claims, like okay, sure. And so
Yeah.
to me, like as arguments, a lot of the poems, like there are some great, she has poems that work in several different ways, like the dad poem, which is brutal,
Mhm.
brutal. But I think like it works with like maybe a little, like I'm just like I have a little bit of vernacular uncertainty about the middle stanza, but like it's a pretty deadly poem. It's real short. Dad, consider the raw potato wrapped in his dress sock. Consider his pocket heavy with loose change. Consider his printed list of white men's names. For beating her and leaving no bruises. For bus fare. For going bail. For vouching for him. He would say, consider, he would say, the gods might understand a man like me. So like setting up those three images and then only afterward giving the three explanations for them. And then this like chilling equivalency that he presents at the end. And I did hear a little bit of that, like for voucher, partly because she writes often without punctuation and I think almost always with no capitalization. And there, I was actually just last night reading and talking about one of Shane's poems where he does the Franz Wright version of that, which I have to confess, both in Franz Wright's case and in Shane's case, drive me a little crazy, which is he uses punctuation inside of lines and stanzas, but then at the end of lines or stanzas, if there is punctuation, he lets it stand implied, which then I just find very confusing. But like the part of the effect here is that you're not sure where the sentence ends. And so that for vouching for him, he would say, consider, he would say, I heard there a little bit of that Shane kind of stutter that he has in some of his poems where he'll repeat a little section or phrase. But like to me, that's a deadly little like tightly shaped. I just haven't heard the construction for going bail, but
Mhm.
like I'm sure
Yeah,
that's like I'm assuming that's a vernacular construction. But then there were like dying felt to me like it was not that was a like it's a fairly I don't think that there's a lot of wasted lines in here. It's a very, very short poem, but it also seems like utterly, utterly unremarkable. Like a very, very familiar argument rendered in familiar terms. And
and
similarly, like my mother is white bones in a weed field on her birthday. She who would be 60 has been 16 years absent at celebrations. For 16 years of minutes, she has been what is missing. This is just to note the arrogance of days continuing to happen as if she were there. Like it's an articulation of a familiar feeling and an honest feeling, but to me, it doesn't seem at all like there doesn't seem to be anything remarkable or like lyrically effective about it. It actually reminded me of an Andrea Cohen poem about her mother it's been widely circulated called "The Committee Weighs In." It's super super short. I'll read it. This is Andrea Cohen. The committee weighs in. I tell my mother I've won the Nobel Prize. Again, she says. Which discipline this time? It's a little game we play. I pretend I'm somebody, and she pretends she isn't dead. And that to me, like they're different poems with just slightly different functions, but like to me, like that's a poem that sort of bothers to do the work of setting a lyric, mousetrap. Whereas this one just sort of is the slogging through of articulating a feeling as is. And again, like there's nothing wrong with that. Like all poets write flat and dead and boring poems, but it does not seem to be the case that Lucille Clifton does not often do that. Like it seems like she does often do that. And then sometimes
yeah.
she like writes a killer.
Okay, so yeah, a couple things. I mean, so dying, I kind of agree. That's one of the ones I look back and I'm like, well, why did I include that one? November 1st, 1975 feels different to me. Like I think there's a pretty long dead patch in the middle, but I like the first sentence. My mother is white bones in a wheat field on her birthday. And the last sentence really, I mean, it lands for me. This is just to note the arrogance of days continuing to happen as if she were here. Um, I think something about starting out in the minimizing everything that she's done up until everything, the couple sentences that have led up to there, like kind of almost acknowledging her own insufficiency. And then there's something just really bare for me about just to note the arrogance of days continuing to happen as if she were here. The sort of hopeless outrage at a world that doesn't contain her mother. It just feels really apt to me.
Yeah, I don't know. I
But
mean,
again, like
that may just be a matter of taste. It
yeah,
does. I do notice like the Jordan Davis is right to say that she is that she is at least in some part heir to William Carlos Williams, and that does
Mhm.
come. And this is just to say,
Yeah. I think the case I was trying to make is not that she doesn't write a lot of poems with statements that aren't on par with the kind of phrasing or insight that she's capable of. I mean to say that I think she's really good at giving a poem a syntactic and sonic shape. Uh,
that's I think it's funny because I do think like I might perfectly disagree there. Like
hmm,
I think on the line by line basis, on the phrase by phrase basis, there are some funny exceptions. Like she blames him at the last for the man and wife, and then in the next stanza, which is parallel, he blames her at last. And you're like, okay, like I'm not. I mean, it's a very very small thing, but like it just suggests to me like, well, why? Like, why bother to write something that close and then make it a little bit off? Like, so there are a few cases where the phrasing, but like for the most part, it does not seem to be that the phrasing is slides. I mean, I think we both recognize a funniness in her line breaks at times, which for me, it's like she and Sharon Olds are of a peas in a pod when it comes to line breaks. Like, what are we doing here? What? But I do often feel as if the overall argument of the poem is a little bit unworked. Um,
yeah, I'm not
yeah.
even talking about the argument. I'm
Okay.
not sure if I agree with you or not on that because just I don't quite think about these poems as arguments, but I'm
Yeah. I,
just
I mean,
talking.
like emotional argument, like not necessarily a rational argument, but like you present several statements in a row in order to sort of produce like to lead emotionally to a place. So yeah, I mean argument in very loose terms.
I guess what I mean is in terms of the phrasing being flat or underword. So to stick with November 1st, 1975.
Yeah.
So in between the first and last sentence, she writes, "She who would be 60." Well, that's unremarkable, but it's
Yeah.
fine. It's moving us along. Has been 16 years against absent at celebrations. That just feels really flat to me.
Yeah.
The combination of absent and celebrations feels very remote. It there's both sonically and in terms of particulars. There's just it's not like a surprising generalization. It's just a
Yeah.
really loose generalization.
I mean, even just like the first sentence in very like striking physical terms tells us she's been dead for a while.
Yeah,
So then, like getting more specific information about that while is not very exciting.
and if she had written, "She who would be 60 has been 16 years," and then something that nailed it, like I think it would be worth going another sentence there. But abstinent celebrations just feels dead to me.
Yeah.
And then for 16 years of minutes, like it almost feels like she's just trying to find a way of not just saying 16 years, like 16 years of minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, she has been what is missing. That's better, but it's still not great. So I think there are times when it's like she has such a knack for writing a great phrase. They're in Brothers, the poem where the devil's talking. I have grown old remembering the garden, the hum of the great cats moving into language, the sweet fume of the man's rib as it rose up and began to walk. Like
Yeah.
it just feels like, oh, you probably could have written a few less poems and put more of that into the poems. And that's the disappointment for me. But like the other thing that I want to say is that one of the things that is remarkable to me is that her collected poems, which includes like a lot of unpublished poems and all kinds of other stuff. It's 700 and something pages, and like admittedly there aren't that many words on a page, but like
Sure.
it, it's a good read, even with a lot of poems that aren't really up to snuff. It's not one of those things where it's like, oh, I've read two poems and one was good and one was bad, and I just need to be done for today because that was a lot. Like, or that thing where I've read three poems and I don't really give a shit about any of them, and I just don't want to keep reading this book. Like it's just there's something remarkably companionable and welcoming and inviting,
Right.
which I think is its own achievement. Like I don't think
Yeah, yeah, for
that's
sure.
something automatic. And so if I could have all of Lucille Clifton's talent and genius and everything else, and then also somehow stand outside her and tell her what to do differently, I would probably suggest that she slow down. But also, it's not such a terrible trade-off. And I think too, it's we're thinking of this. This is somebody who's raising a lot of kids all by
Yeah,
herself
yeah.
at the point. And like these are poems she wrote on the kitchen table and hurried off. And that's not the main point, but
No, I mean, like she,
it's there.
but again, like there is such a thing as somebody who is a remarkable figure, independent of the value of her work. Like that is
Yeah,
that
but
is a
I
real
don't.
thing. But I think like it sounds like you're a little bit trying to kind of grant both and with that question.
Yeah, it's yeah, that's fair.
Like what if
But
she had had all the time and
right,
luxury in the world? Then
yeah,
like, and then how are the poems?
that's fair. But I do think I think the best poems are fantastic. I think a remarkable number of the not best poems have things that are fantastic in them. And I think to a surprising degree, even the poems that are neither of those still achieve a kind of welcome and a kind of presence that feels pretty unusual to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that writing poems that are readable is a real accomplishment given how many poems are a chore to read.
Yeah,
Um,
more than readable.
but what I
Uh,
mean, like, but like as you
in,
said, like if you can write 700 pages
enjoyable,
of poems that are
welcoming,
a good
inviting.
read, that you want to keep reading rather
Hmm.
than
Yeah,
thinking like, oh God, I've done my 10 pages for today.
yeah,
Jesus fucking Christ. Thank God that's over. Which is sometimes how I felt reading, say, the Dream Songs at times. They're like, come on,
yeah.
John. Like there's so much good stuff here, but there's so much of it.
Yeah. And I've talked to you. I'm reading Walcott Selected right now, which I
Mhm.
had never read much Walcott, and it's wonderful. But there's this tuning and attention and all, and I read one poem that I really love, and I put it aside for a little while, and then I come back and I read it a second time, and I'm pretty used up, and like it feels, it feels used up, like in the way that like you've done something that's meaningful, you
Right. Yeah.
used your body. But these men should not do that without feeling flat either.
That was my conversation with Jonathan. You can find Jonathan. I just, at this point, I just include Jonathan, a link to his stuff in the frequently mentioned names portion of the show notes because he comes up so often. So he's down there, but you can find his packet on Lucille Clifton in the main part of the show notes. And as I said, we did talk a good deal more about Clifton, but I'm going to put that in a Secret Show episode coming up. We've got a lot of stuff on there now, but both poetry related and un. But yeah, Coleman may have had a point. Anyway, here is a preview of the most recent Secret Show episode I recorded with Alice, which was a lot of fun. I hope you will enjoy it.
But no, I'm so keen to talk to you about this imposter syndrome stuff
Yeah,
because it seems to have come up a few times, like momentarily on the show, and I've been really
yeah,
fascinated. You said to me on email that you're 90% sure that it doesn't exist or is a radical misnomer. And I want to
yeah.
know what you think people mean when they say, I have really bad imposter syndrome.
Yeah, well, I think it's maybe I'm now leaning more toward the latter than the former. I think there is a thing, but I think it may be sort of like what we do with problems like depression, where like probably there's several different things and we're calling them one name.
Yeah.
Um, so it was after I sent you that petulant note, I then went ahead and bothered to do my homework and read this paper called "The Imposter Phenomenon in High Achieving Women: Dynamics and Therapeutic Intervention" by Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Imes, which was published in 1978, and it appears to be the origin of the term imposter syndrome, which was originally called imposter phenomenon. And
Yeah.
in it, they talk about specifically it does seem to be mostly women, and it is I mean, the examples they used were like striking of women who were, let's see, included in our sample have been 95 undergraduate women and 10 PhD faculty women at a small, academically acclaimed private Midwestern coeducational college, 15 undergraduates, 20 graduate students, and 10 faculty members at a large southern urban university, 6 medical students from northern and southern universities, and 22 professional women in such fields as law, anthropology, nursing, counseling, religious education, social work, occupational therapy, and teaching. They were primarily white middle to upper class women between the ages of 20 and 45. And they said things about themselves. I mean, I have like some uncertainty about like what they're saying versus what they feel versus what they're saying to other people that they feel. But they said things like, my stupidity will be discovered. I am like, I have only been fooling everybody. I am actually like, I think what one hears today is like a statement like, I have really bad imposter syndrome. But like, if that is what you were saying, you do not have imposter syndrome. You have insecurity that you have diagnosed as being inaccurate. These women were not saying I have imposter syndrome. These women were saying I am stupid. I did not earn this. I have only been rewarded for qualities that have nothing to do with actual merit.
Yeah.
So like that's like one distinction to make. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just think that the bit that encapsulates it really well is where they talk about the cycle and how it's self-reinforcing.
Yeah.
They say the fear that my stupidity will be discovered, quote unquote, is constantly present. Consequently, the woman studies or works very hard to prevent the discovery. Hard work and study pay off in excellent performance and approval from authorities. The cycle, worry about intelligence, hard work and cover-up strategies, good grades or performance, approval and temporary good feelings is reinforcing. So it's that magical thinking.
Yeah, although I was a little bit confused by their emphasis on effort, where they seem to say like, oh, these poor women, they kept attributing their success to effort. They're like, well, like, is effort faking it? Like, effort isn't that mostly what we're talking about here? Like, it seemed like the distinction they drew was in the abstract in particular was like some of the men they interviewed, and it wasn't clear exactly what the methods were of like just like comparing men to women, but like it seemed like the men they were talking to for the most part attributed their success to talent, and the women they talked to said, oh no, I am an imposter, all I did was work really hard to earn it. And I think, well, all right, that seems like a strange distinction to make. Like I don't know,
it's a little bit more than that though.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I think it's like I had to work really hard to cover up the fact that I'm actually an idiot and a fake. I worked overtime to keep up with all these people around me. Eventually, they're going to figure out that I am an idiot and a fake.
Yeah.
And if I manage to get through, get the achievement, get the accolade, it's because I was lucky or because I busted my ass making sure that nobody found me out.
So a thought I have had lately, partly in response to this, is that like the thing that I have heard after this fact was that what ruined my generation of Americans, particularly like white middle class Americans, and especially white middle class male Americans, what ruined us was being told by our parents that they were proud of us no matter what, and that we were smart and good. And then that destroyed us as human beings because we assumed we had intrinsic value and didn't have to earn anything. If you would like to hear the rest of that conversation, go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com, where you will find that episode along with 80 plus others, all pretty worth listening to. I think it's a lot of fun. I think it's a lot of fun. People seem to like it. They tend to stick around once they sign up for it, and it is, as always, pretty fucking cheap. All right, talk to you all soon.